So here we go with our second video in our Assassin series. Now, unlike our previous assassin and his conspirators, our next assassin not only was politically aligned with his victim, but he worked completely alone. Charles J. Guiteau was a failed clerk, businessman, and minister who had been divorced to his wife for infidelity that the prostitute had actually happily spoken out against him during the divorce hearings. In 1870s, he supported Democratic candidate Horace Greeley, who Guiteau believed would sincerely win the election against Ulysses Grant, and that Greeley would make Guiteau the ambassador to Chile. Greeley, though, would lose to Grant, which was easy to predict. Guiteau would take a hiatus from politics until the election of 1870, where he switched his political party to Republican and endorsed the stalwart Republicans, who were the Republicans who wanted to stick to the Grant policies and era laws against the half-breed Republicans who supported James Blaine, who opposed Grant-era policies and such. But neither side would actually get the nomination. Instead, Civil War veteran and moderate James Garfield would get the Republican nomination, with his running mate, Chester A. Arthur. Guiteau switched his speech from Grant vs. Hancock to Garfield vs. Hancock. He gave the speech twice and then handed out copies to men at the Republican committee. It was mostly ignored because people found Guiteau to be aggressive and overbearing. But on November 2nd, 1880, Garfield beat Winfield Scott Hancock by an electoral victory of 214 to 155, and a popular vote difference of only a few thousand, being both men were heroic Civil War generals, but Hancock was viewed as more sympathetic to former Confederates. Guiteau immediately began to take credit for the victory. He demanded he be given the consulship to Vienna and the Austrian Empire to members of Garfield's new cabinet. But then he decided and said he wanted a posting to Paris, to the government of Jules Gervais in France. He mainly would contact Garfield's now Secretary of State, James Blaine. Now, people, especially today, since we've had such active vice presidents in these last 30 years, don't realize that the real chief advisor to the president is the Secretary of State. That is why when Lincoln was assassinated, they targeted Seward, because he was the one who knew what was going on in the government and cabinet. So Guiteau contacted Blaine was in a way a good way to get to Garfield, as Blaine was Garfield's ear in a way. It's believed that high-level Republicans would say of Guiteau, he was mad as a hatter. And Blaine, who on April 14th, 1881, Guiteau approached him in public in Washington, which finally caused Blaine to snap, saying, "Never speak to me again on the Paris consulship as long as you live." Now at this point, Guiteau was extremely distraught and was furious at Garfield, who was preparing to get rid of the patronage system, aka the spoils system. This is what would have been the thing to establish him as a consul, because without it, the Senate needed to approve his appointment. But he saw a chance at achieving his hopes of a consulship. Vice President Arthur was a stalwart, and he believed if he was president, it would help him and, in quotes, save the Republican Party. Back then, the public was a little more aware of the presidential movements, and Guiteau had made an attempt to shoot Garfield in June. But Garfield was with his wife Lucretia, who was ill, and Guiteau didn't want to kill her, only Garfield. I know, so sweet. But on July 2nd, 1881, Guiteau laid in wait at Baltimore Potomac Station, where Garfield was going to come for a train trip to his alma mater to give a speech, then go on his scheduled vacation. With him was his two sons and the Secretary of State, James Blaine. He would also be joined by his Secretary of War, Robert Todd Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's son, whose family would be joining the Garfields on the vacation. As Garfield and Blaine approached the train, Guiteau appeared, pointing a British bulldog revolver at Garfield's back. He fired the first shot, which grazed Garfield's shoulder, to which Garfield said, "My God, what is that?" He then fired a second shot, square into Garfield's back. Garfield collapsed and Guiteau shoved the revolver back in his pocket. He had a cab waiting for him outside the station, but he was intercepted by police officer Patrick Kearney, who had run in after hearing the shots go off. Kearney grabbed Guiteau, saying, "In God's name, man, what did you shoot the president for?" Guiteau, seeing no wrong in his deed, said, "I'm a stalwart and want Arthur for president." Now, Garfield was a popular president at this point, so people were attempting to harm Guiteau, but the police were able to secure him in custody and lock him away from the public. Robert Todd Lincoln had run to Garfield's side. I believe he was quoted as saying it took him 15 seconds to run from where he was to Garfield. It helped carry him to the second floor of the train station, where doctors were attempting to locate the bullet. He was put into somewhat of shock, remembering his own father's assassination. But the doctors were attempting to save the president, who was still conscious, alert, and could feel everything that was going on. Now, in all honesty, Garfield's initial wound was not that bad. In fact, it was an extremely survivable wound. But the issue was the surgeon had continued to prod and try different ways of finding the bullet, making the initial wound much larger in their attempts to locate the bullet. Even Alexander Graham Bell attempted using an early form of metal detector to find the bullet. Unfortunately, they could not locate the bullet still because the bed Garfield was on had a metal frame. Garfield would die finally on September 19th, 1881. Garfield awoke, grabbing his heart, looking at his friend David Swam, and said, "Swam, can't you stop the pain?" Garfield then died, and Chester Arthur was sworn in as president. Now, in the 80 days that Garfield suffered, the case against Guiteau was being set for attempted murder trial. But when Garfield died, even though it's debatable the bullet caused his death, the charges were now changed to murder. Now, Guiteau's defense was an insanity defense. He was openly belligerent with his defense attorney, who was his brother-in-law. He would go into tirades and speeches throughout the trial, and even said that God had directed him to do it. So if Guiteau is guilty, then God must be as well. He actually, while on trial, with the assistance of the New York Herald, wrote an autobiography that he completed with an advertisement for a woman to date him. I know, romantic, isn't he? His brother-in-law, George Scoville, wanted to use the medical malpractice, though, to save Guiteau. Now, like I said before, Garfield was an extremely popular president through his reforms, but Guiteau believed that he was a celebrity for having shot him. But instead, he was one of the most despised men in the world, and especially in the United States, and no court was going to let him survive. But Guiteau was so out of his mind that he was actually preparing a lecture tour and even a run for president from his imprisonment at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C. But the inevitable was going to come to him. He was found guilty of murder. Scoville attempted to appeal the ruling, but it was, as predictably, denied. On June 30th, 1882, he was sentenced to hang. Now, most people, when they are going to die, are remorseful. It's a solemn, very quiet event. Not for Charles J. Guiteau, though. No, indeed. Instead, he dressed in his Sunday best. He wrote a long poem and then danced his way up to the gallows, continuously declaring, "I am going to the Lordy." He wanted to have an orchestra present for the reading of his poem, but that was of course denied. But he was allowed to speak it. The following: "I am going to the Lordy, I am so glad. I am going to the Lordy, I am so glad. I am going to the Lordy, glory hallelujah, glory hallelujah. I am going to the Lordy. I love the Lordy with all my soul. glory, hallelujah. And the reason I am going to Lordy, glory, hallelujah, glory, hallelujah, I am going to the Lord. I saved my party and my land, glory, hallelujah. But they have murdered me for it, and that is the reason I am going to the Lordy. Glory, hallelujah, glory, hallelujah. I am going to the Lordy. I wonder what I will do when I get to the Lordy. I guess that I will weep no more when I get to the Lordy. Glory, hallelujah. I wonder what I will see when I get to the Lordy. I expect to see most glorious things, beyond all earthly conception, when I am with the Lordy. Glory, hallelujah, glory, hallelujah, I am with the Lordy. I mean, clearly he was sane, right? He then signaled to the executioner he was ready by dropping the paper his poem was written on. The executioner put the hood over Guiteau, who still had a giant smile on his face, and hung him after he dropped the paper. His body was moved to the multiple different locations until arriving at what became known as the National Museum of Health and Medicine, where even today you can go and see his brain, which is on display. Now, the reality of Charles J. Guiteau is he was very clearly insane up to the moment of his death. But because of the rage that the entire nation was feeling of the assassination of Garfield, nothing short of execution was going to be good enough. Also, the murderer Garfield did the exact opposite of what Guiteau wanted when Congress passed the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act, which ended the spoil system. Unfortunately, still the government refused to take on presidential security until another 20 years later, which we will discuss tomorrow. Thanks for watching. Guiteau is a truly frightening individual, a lunatic who ran free for far longer than he should have been able to. Tomorrow we'll be discussing Leon Czolgosz and William McKinley. Thanks for joining us. Please like, share, and comment. If you're new, please subscribe. I have new content up daily, and I'm happy to have our community continue to grow. Thanks again, and see y'all in the next one.